The first thing I want to read, I didn't write. It's called Poem, and it is by Wendy Trevino, who's in the back there. So I'll just begin with her poem. Poem. Santander Bank was smashed into. I was getting nowhere with a novel, and suddenly the reader became the book, and the book was burning. And you said it was reading, but reading hits you on the head. So it was really burning, and the reader was dead, and I was happy for you. And I had been standing there a while when I got your text. Santander Bank was smashed into. There were barricades in London. There were riot girls drinking Riot Rose. I think it's rosé. Might be a typo. Wendy? I don't know. The party melted into the riot, melted into the party, like fluid roadblocks and gangs and temporary autonomous zones, and everyone and we all stopped reading. Okay, this next piece is for David's chapbook on violence that Chris mentioned via David. And it's more of an essay. It's called Some More Reflections on Violence, and I think it's coming out on May Day, is my impression. David asked me to write something about violence for a chapbook. This was potentially what violence is, as in this act is violent and this other act is not. But a definition seemed wrong to me, or beside the point. Ornament, too, felt so sadly deflated, entirely on the wrong ship, so to speak. So this is not really a poem and not a manifesto, or not one that makes claims like we want, we need, we are. I'm more interested in the we that sits behind political writing, and also writing about other things, and what this we has to do with violence. Laura said she is tired of talking about it, and I agree. Mostly I'm tired of talking about violence, nonviolence, and associating violence talk with being tired. We are always failing, failing and failing, until we aren't failing anymore, Francesca said, but not in a sad way when we were all there, the not men, talking about it. At Wiley Manual on a different day, I remember Zhivka making this gesture with her hand, as though she were throwing away and up a tiny scrap of paper over and over again. This was probably after it, but I remember it as the first or maybe the second meeting of the Marxist Feminist Queers group at Anastasia's house on the floor when we were watching Oki's favorite clip from La Cérémonie, where Sandrine Bonnaire cups an invisible explosion with her fingers like this. She, the character, is feeling for something in the air over and over and making that sound. She is making that sound and feeling for something, not gently as though petting, but as though stabbing or pinching, as though there were a threat there in her hand, but also as something that could not get away. I was thinking about this way of feeling for something over and over, and the conversations that some are tired of now, about violence, nonviolence. There is talk about violence, nonviolence as being or not being the linked arms of standing bodies. There is talk about violence, nonviolence when dumpsters are set on fire. There is talk about violence, nonviolence when batons break the ribs and fingers of protesters. There is talk about violence, nonviolence when police shoot an already handcuffed man. There is talk about violence, nonviolence after anti-police riots. There is talk about violence, nonviolence after the breaking of storefront windows. There is talk about violence, nonviolence when streets are blocked and when protesters are hit by cars. There's talk about violence, nonviolence when persons are raped in the community and what this community is and the people in it. There's talk of violence, nonviolence during the prison hunger strikes and the student hunger strikes and the wildcat strikes. There is not talk or less talk about how none of these things are the same thing. If the sameness of all these things being violent is assumed, why not just say it in this way of everything being the same? To just say the pane of glass is like a head of a person is like a dumpster on fire. Or then if it is a spectrum and one kind of violence is at the bottom, then where is everything else? Is breaking a head more or less violent than breaking a glass window? Is raping a person more or less violent than setting a fire? Does it matter if the fire burns in a dumpster or in a car or in a store or in the 1960s? Is breaking a rib with a baton violent the way that blocking a port is violent? Is the driving cars more or less violent? Is the highway violent, or only the way that it separates neighborhoods and is blocking the highway with bodies more or less violent? Are injunctions violent the way gangs are violent, and which violent is this? Are stay-away orders violent or more or less violent than blocking a bus or blocking a bank? The law that says a woman must listen to the sound of the fetal heart or look at the sonogram before she can have an abortion, is that violent, and in which way? Crimes of hate as more or less violent than non-criminalized hate is violent, and where does it count and not count? Are rubber bullets more or less violent than a crowd is violent, and which violence comes first? Is the violence young persons or old persons or white persons, and how does this affect violence? The student filming everything with his phone from a ledge of the building said that the woman should not be in front with the violence, there should be men there to protect them, and we said, fuck you. Was that violent? Someone said that we must save the students, and someone else that we were all being childish. Is that more or less violent? Is the prison and the university system more or less violent than the linking of arms? Is it not violent, and how many nots? Is saying no more or less violent than saying yes? And how many times can you say yes? Where? Which yes? Where? Imagine the space where nothing is violent and show me that space. The we that decides what is more or less violent, what is violent, non-violent. Which we gets to say yes, it is this, but not that. What is left out of that we, and what is still left out of my we, is that violent? What about the night downtown outside the city jail during one of the noise protests? It must have been on the 4th of July because there were so many fireworks. Well, it could have just been our fireworks for the noise and no 4th of July. We were all there with the pots and the pans and the sound system in a cart, the fireworks exploding somewhere a few blocks away and the police looking at us and us looking up. There are no light switches inside holding cells. It is fluorescent all the nighttime there, but the holding cells all the way up were flickering in the dark and the noise. The sheets being held over the windows inside the cells all the way up and then taken off like a Morse code. But no one knows Morse code anymore. So it was just the sound system and the yelling and the fireworks exploding, the sirens and the police lines, and seeing the lighted windows go dark and then light and then dark, on and off the sheets held over, and then held off the windows inside the jail, over and over, on, off, on, while we looked up. It was the most successful spoken line you could live off of, or that was the idea. Being saved in the middle of a tense situation, or the swallowed flashlight flashing, the idea of a tense situation. An emergency with an open mouth mouthing, the locking mechanism in the seasons of general preparedness. It was semi-precious and tended to slow down, knees creaking, hinge joint the back and forth, resembling Delaware, box stores and blockish. It was a wheelbarrow and plums, etc., all stalled into Sunday or a differently named day. On the way to the freeway, the docks, the day laborers, edgewise, it was a video paused, the time code emotionally charged. To approximate, it was a free hand stroking the free and clear, or longish eye contact on public transportation, the thighs touching like a row of hands. The long to short, the geographic regions, the breakfast news, the bedtime news, the family romance, the childhood fantasy, a perpetual phase of spring metaphors that remain extremely calm under the circumstances. By this time next year, it will be exactly the thing I just wanted to say too. It was a loss of function, the alarm, a shorter form of waiting. It was the bridge to the sound of really fast typing, the superlative sounding. And this is the last thing I'm going to read because I don't want to take up too much time. It's called Riot Porn. As a twitching across familiar linked images, concomitant sense of remoteness, generally, the squares, and fantastic collision, some dashing in Bangkok, a trans-animated cow, the lurking beautiful circuits, ends buzzing aloft. The wanting was daily and the story was not. For being a compendium of frothy sounds, the occasion to use the word gaslight, a heroics of discovery, one hot mess, the traffic befaunt. Accounting for variations of longing for, elemental fortunes, dislodging a compilation of more generous symptoms that would nod emphatically in a personal conversation, which you are the flounce bustle of a green island, buttoned heels, clicking time, for relatively short duration and duration as a faculty of standing in front of. The hairstyles aboard this vessel and the evening of study, The savageries and volcanic ash, a halo across the continent, appended by grease, meaning fire. Attempts were made to consider the valley directly above the screen, or better, attempts were made towards the specters of a yellow window, glow, a fugitive craft, particulars touching a rough edge of something knit, sour and sweet, intoning a look of things now peaked to gray. Lining the vessel in tiny knots tied by a sailor's hand, all the fibers are floating, brights and rose in fire, edges prickling, smeared, and invertebrate bent. Breathing, hawk-jawed, the wet flitting insects buzz, subtropic stitching across. The life cycle of an eel between Mumbai, Lisbon, and deep blue days, an adolescent, as a prepositional form of intermittent night. The slideshow of shields on a train the color of freight. My curtains caught on misplaced piles of books, the newspapers, flaunting their assorted denouements. The incomplete accidents of fire and water, hesitancies of a marriage plot, my queen's crumpled letter desire, linguistic interiors, a trail of signs unfurled, into the markets, the face of the crowds, the swarming crowd, a villain, the crowd, the category of villain, the category of city, as laughing in a foreign language, the crowding a hiccup romance, occasion of dastardly, the fuming crowds, petals streaming, sailors, crowds, the apostrophe, O Rose, how thou art, the vagabond's inheritance found. When we were young and agile, in an astonishing flood of light, illuminated papers, a vessel of sound. Incantation and the long vowels escape. Rock, saw, the pirates standing watch, the currents breaking. Thank you.